Good morning, everyone.
Yes.
I'm Harriet Tregoning. I'm the director of the Office of Planning in the District of Columbia, and I'm really delighted to be with you here this morning. I think what you're talking about is the critical issue that's confronting cities and states all across the country, and in some ways, the events surrounding Superstorm Sandy has made it much more urgent and critical for you, and I think in the long term that'll end up being a blessing. This issue is in front of everybody, but not everyone feels the urgency that you do to begin to act. Someone said it earlier that we're in a race, we're in a competition. We compete all the time with each other, but increasingly as regions or mega regions, we compete all across the globe for investment, for resources, for talent. And we have been looking at the characteristics of those places in the world that seem to be winning that global competition. And you know, there might be 20 attributes, there might be 3. I've split it up into 6 things that I think that globally competitive and sustainable regions have in common. And what's funny is that for a lot of places, these were lessons that we learned the hard way after losing the competition. Sometimes the cities to the suburbs, sometimes some parts of the country to other parts of the country, or to places around the world. Distinctive neighborhoods and districts. Cities used to think that they had to be like the suburbs in order to compete, and they were never very good at it. Many of our cities and towns have wonderful historic architecture, a great gridded network of streets, a real sense of place that's very hard to reproduce brand new. They have multiple transportation options, including transit. We saw a great example of how important that was after the storm in New York City in particular. When the subway went down, if you were on a bicycle, you were pretty much unaffected. But for almost every other mode of transportation, there were whole parts of the city that you just couldn't leave or get to. A walkable urbanity, because every transit trip, everybody's a pedestrian at some part of the time, and increasingly, we're living in what people might call the experience economy. So even where we choose to shop, we want to be in a place that makes it an experience, because commodities we can get over the internet. You know, we don't need to leave our homes for that. So giving people a great and unique experience is incredibly important. Green and sustainable development practices, and to that I'd add resilient practices. That's a word that I think is increasingly a watchword for all of us. Shared social and economic prosperity, and great quality environments and access to nature. I'm just going to focus on really 2 of these things this morning. The most important investment I would say we can make, and certainly New Jersey knows that, is transportation. It's transportation that really shapes our development patterns, and it is increasingly a luxury. And it's a competitive advantage for places that have that luxury of choice. In Washington, we have the subway, which is fantastic. We have great bus service. We have great commuter rail. We have the nation's largest bike sharing system that had nearly 3 million trips in its first 2 years. We've got a lot of car sharing, nearly 10,000 car sharing members in the District of Columbia, and now lots and lots of car sharing services that are competing with each other, not just Zipcar and Avis, who's doing car sharing, but we now have something called Car2Go, which is produced by Daimler. An auto manufacturer is now in the car sharing business because they see the future it may not be about owning, it might be about using their vehicles. So they had the fastest global ramp up among 40 cities on the globe in Washington, D.C. And we expect to see a lot more of that kind of car sharing service. Transportation is critically important, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is. So important that we are looking at some major new transportation investments. One of those is not that new. At the turn of this last century, we had 100 miles of streetcar network in the District of Columbia, and we're going to bring some of that back now with a modern streetcar that will open this year in 2013. This is the proposed system. 37 miles of streetcar. And what's really important is that this we look at as an investment that's going to help to shape the development pattern in the District of Columbia. We expect that 95% of new office development will be along the streetcar corridor, and that 80% of the new residential development will be along the corridor. We expect to triple the number of residents that are within a quarter mile of fixed guideway transit. Right now, they're around the nodes of our metro stations, but because we're going to have 37 continuous miles of streetcar, we think that we can have 45% of all of our residents within a quarter mile of fixed guideway rail, and that's going to make an immense difference in terms of how people can travel and how much they have to depend on cars. We're making some other big moves. Amtrak has announced a major new master plan for Union Station designed to triple the number of boardings at Union Station. And not just that, but it's also being done in conjunction with a massive new air rights project that will really reknit the infrastructure, reknit the city grid over completely over the rail yard. So tripling the boardings at Union Station means that we'll have more boardings there than the Baltimore-Washington Airport, the Dulles Airport, and National Airport currently have today. That's a lot of travel. That's a lot of access. You know, you can start your trip and go anywhere in the world at Union Station, and we think it's going to be a major factor in the growth of Washington. This is a snapshot of what that's going to look like inside. Really, really beautiful. And so part of the result of having this luxury of choices is that right now in Washington, almost 40% of households don't have even a single vehicle. And that's throughout the city. It's not based on income. And I have to say that it has hugely helped with affordability. Our Washington residents are spending only about 9% of household income on transportation. The national average is 19%, and in some parts of our region, they're actually spending 25% of income. So we're not a low-cost area to live, nor is much of New Jersey, but being able to put your housing and your transportation budgets together makes it a lot more affordable. I'll also say, we're talking about resilience, these transportation choices help to make the city resilient. In 2008, when the recession really began to bite, we noticed an odd phenomenon. Cars were dropping off our DMV rolls in the hundreds. That's because people were able to dial down their transportation costs and weather the recession. So when someone had a job loss in a household, they could ditch a car and they could stay in their homes. So we had very little foreclosure, we had very little bankruptcy. Now, you might say, well, sure, you're where the federal government is. You know, those jobs, you know, pretty much stayed around and even increased, you know, during the recession thanks to the stimulus. But no, if you look across our region, we're a single job market. We experienced the recession very differently across the region, and it was strongly correlated with those jurisdictions that had lots of these transportation choices. They all had a similar effect: very little foreclosure, very little bankruptcy, and very little decrease in property values. So that made our local government resilient. You know, we were able to more or less maintain the level of services that we had before, and we rebounded much more quickly than others in our region because of these choices. So and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. Like our colleagues in New York, we think that that sustainability is really a word for the future, and that for us, it's not just a green plan. It's really about reshaping the economy of the District of Columbia and remaking how the city itself does business. But we also see it continuing some momentum that we already have and enhancing our competitive position. We're already a city that has more green roof than any city in the United States. We have an enormous number of LEED certified buildings. We had 9 in 2006 when we passed the the nation's most stringent green building law, and you see how much progress we've made since then. What was really great is our private sector wasn't even required to comply until January of 2012. By then, they had built more than 200 LEED certified buildings, and not just the bare minimum, which is what the legislation required, but they were building mostly gold and platinum buildings. And it's really become a race to the top for them. A lot of them scoff at LEED and are trying to do net zero buildings and buildings that are really on the cutting edge. Our municipal government gets 100% of its power from renewable sources. We're the only municipality in the country to do that, and 11% of all the city's energy comes from renewable sources. We've got more parks and open space per capita. Our challenge is to make that open space useful for stormwater management, and even, dare I say, make it food productive. So these are the kinds of things that we're starting with, but the vision is to make us the most sustainable city, the greenest, healthiest, most livable city in the U.S. By 2032, and I think we're well on our way. That means doing things like attracting another 250,000 new and existing residents, retaining those residents, cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, cutting citywide energy use by 50%, making 75% of all of our trips walk, bike, or transit. I think you saw the previous slide. We're already at 50% now, so it may not be that much of a stretch. Sending zero waste to the landfill. And let's talk about the economy. I mentioned that this reshapes our economy. 3 times as many small businesses, 5 times as many green jobs, and permanently cutting the unemployment rate by 50% in the city. That's an explicit goal of our sustainable DC project. This slide might look familiar because we're doing the same kind of analysis that New York City is doing when it comes to gray versus green infrastructure. This is a project that I have to thank you for here in New Jersey. So George Hawkins, who was a former director of New Jersey Future and a former director of the Stony Brook and Millstone Watershed Association. This is actually his project. He now heads our large water utility, DC Water. He rebranded it. You know, he's kind of good at that. DC Water, it used to be the DC Water and Sewer Authority. And the slogan is "Water is Life." That's his new slogan. You know, we're very lucky to have him. This is an incredibly ambitious project. We're already committed to spend $4 billion to address our combined sewer overflow program. But none of us, and George in particular, were happy with how that money was going to be spent, which is in immensely large tunnels, you know, beneath the ground. Immensely large tunnels that, like New York, would be used about 280 days of the year when we got more than a quarter inch of rainfall, and where all of the labor, all of the materials, everything would come from out of our economy in order to install these tunnels. So we are going to still do the tunnel for Anacostia, but we're really looking to try to take green infrastructure approaches to other parts of the city. And for the Potomac and Rock Creek watersheds, and we're going to be doing a $40 to $50 million pilot project to really evaluate how well this is going to work. And if it does work, we're going to ramp up to a $500 million project in our city, and that's just what DC Water is going to spend alone, or shall I say our DC Water ratepayers, which is all of our citizens. And for some of the same reasons, because these projects don't just manage stormwater. Green infrastructure produces thousands of jobs. For the water project alone, it's 3,500 jobs just in the pilot phase. Improve stormwater capture, absolutely. Reduce the urban heat island effect. I don't know about you, but in Washington, the summers have been getting hotter, which was pretty unbearable to begin with. But we are now 10 degrees hotter in the center of the city than in our suburban areas. And New Jersey is the most urbanized state in the country. This has got to be something that's on your mind. It has to be possible to be outside, you know, even as the climate begins to change. So more tree canopy, greater energy savings, all of this and more are the benefits that we would get from taking a green infrastructure approach, because no one can afford to spend even a single infrastructure dollar these days and only get a dollar's worth of services back. We need $3 and $4 and $5 worth of services, and that's really our challenge, to make our infrastructure do double and triple duty, which is possible, but it's not the way that we've thought about it in the past. And how is that working for us? I think it's working. I mean, we had our first real decade of growth in 2010 after 60 years of declining population. But in the first 2 years of this decade, we actually had as much growth as in the last 10 years. And we are now growing relative to our region for the first time since before World War II. And who is coming to Washington? Nearly 60% of our growth is people under the age of 35. And in the most highly educated region of the country, they're much more highly educated than average. So it has begun to skew our economy. We love the federal government, but we don't want to be a one-company town. So most of our job growth has been in the private sector, and many companies that never wanted to be in Washington before because the land costs more, the rents are higher, are saying, 80% of my cost is personnel. If I can attract, recruit, and retain the talent I need to be competitive, then I have to be in Washington. And that is really what we're starting to see. And I think for all of us, that's really the end game. How can we attract investment? How can we attract and recruit and retain talent? And I think that smart 21st century infrastructure is really the way. Thank you.